But I'm joined now by the New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet. Welcome, Dom.
Evening, Sherry.
Now, look, I want to start with the news today. Before we get into the ScoMo effect, I want to start with the news today that James Packer is selling a large share, about 20% of Crown, to a Chinese businessman. I mean, this construction of Barangaroo was so controversial to begin with, and there was a special process for it. It didn't, go through the usual tender process that buildings like that would have to go through. It really was subject to special approvals, and this was obviously when Barry O'Farrell was Premier. But now we find out that, this building that's going to be one of the most significant figures in the Sydney skyline is, in effect, going to be owned by a Chinese businessman.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was an unsolicited proposal from the outset, and obviously that's helped fund the open space as well of down at Barangaroo, which I think in the main, particularly if you look at the northern part, it's been incredibly successful use of public space. There's no doubt there were clear restrictions on that gaming licence, and ILGA, the gaming authority, Independent Liquor and Gaming Authority, will be, my understanding, will be looking at that transaction, and if there are any issues in respect of it, they'll investigate and advise the government accordingly.
Because my understanding is that one of the reasons it was approved was actually that we were expecting a lot of wealthy Chinese tourists to come to Australia and gamble, and that revenue would end up in effect in our economy. But if this does go through, I understand it has to go through the approvals process, then in effect, that revenue wouldn't be in the Australian economy at all.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, and I think there's no doubt this licence had significant restrictions on it. So any changes to that makeup will need to be reviewed by the independent authority. They will do that, and if that process has changed, they would advise the government, and we would consider our options.
Would you be putting forward a position from the New South Wales government to the independent authority on whether this should go ahead or not?
No, as long as there has not been any material change to the licence in the way it was granted by the government in the first place, and there was significant work and investigation done by the independent authority at the time, then it's really a matter for that independent authority to advise the government. That licence was given. There were significant restrictions. It doesn't come into effect until I think next 2 years. So we'll work through it. Obviously, this has just happened today, and the government will consider its options on advice from the independent authority. But
you'd consider revoking that licence if necessary?
Oh, well, the licence was given with significant restrictions on it, and it would be a matter for the authority to advise the government if there have been any material changes to that licence, and there's no information before the government that would be the case.
Now, I want to move to what everyone's speaking about, the ScoMo effect. It's been in the news this week, front page of The Australian a couple of days ago. There's apparently been more weekly mortgage applications in the past couple of weeks than in the past 6 months. People are booking holidays again. The auction clearance rates were 60% last weekend, which is quite extraordinary, or above 60%. And the Master Builders Australia said that industry has had the most positive post-election bounce in confidence in 25 years. In your view, is this tangible, this ScoMo effect that everyone's talking about?
Well, I think so. I mean, particularly here in New South Wales, we've had the extraordinary situation where we've gone through 2 elections in the space of only a couple of months. But we've obviously come off, particularly with the property market, a significant downturn, a softening in the market. I think prices are down about 14% since 2017. You mentioned the auction clearance rates. They've come off highs a couple of years ago, around 80% down to 50%, but already just on one weekend, they're up. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves, but back up to well above 60%. So that's incredibly pleasing, and obviously I think some of the concerns around negative gearing that were in play, a lot of the changes in tax policy that were potentially coming into play under a potential shortened government probably caused concern. I think there's obviously a slowdown with the economy before any election, but I think this one particularly, given the issues that were at stake.
There's a sense that people were worried. I think voters were quite worried about how the impact of some of Labor's proposed policies, changes of negative gearing, were going to impact on the economy. But your own modelling released during the campaign actually showed that the impact was only going to be about $200 million over the forward estimates.
Yeah, I mean, that was initial modelling from Treasury, but there's also the uncertainty around that. I think the concern that we had, particularly when you have some challenges with economic growth going forward. One of the biggest areas around that slowdown was a softening in the property market. So for the Labor Party, who had come in and put a negative gearing policy in place at a time when the property market was soaring, we were in a very, very different situation. And I think what they should have done is had the humility to change that policy, or at least put a pause on it until such time as those headwinds had come.
Frydenberg and Morrison argued that part of the reason for the property slowdown was that people were worried about the changes. Do you think that's right?
Well, I think whenever there's uncertainty, and particularly around elections and substantial prospects of changes in the tax system, I think there's no doubt that people will become more cautious. And a slowdown in the property market has trickle-down effects to consumption as well. We saw in the federal budget, we've written down around $2 billion in GST receipts because consumption is down. So the property market does have a significant impact on the economy, and I think the changes that Labor were bringing in certainly played a certain caution out there in the community, particularly once the property market was already softening.
Well, it's not just GST receipts that have been written down, but also you've already had to downgrade, in effect, by $8 billion what you were expecting in stamp duty revenue.
Yeah.
And I imagine that's going to further be downgraded again. But is that going to make it more difficult for you to meet your election commitments?
No, we're in a solid budget position here in New South Wales, and we've been running surpluses, not for the sake of it, so to make sure we can deliver on the services and the election commitments that we have made. We have, unlike other states like Victoria, who have just written down, I think, $5 billion in their recent budget on Monday when it came to stamp duty receipts, we have been, I guess, writing down over the last 12 months that amount, to, as you say, to around a bit over $8 billion. At the same time, we've delivered solid surpluses. We made a number of election commitments, and I think what you'll see in this upcoming budget on June 18 here in New South Wales is solid surpluses, our election commitments met, and continued to build in the infrastructure and deliver in the services that we've been doing over the last 8 years.
There have been predictions this week from people like Shane Oliver that the property market is expected to pick up later this year. What are your forecasts showing you?
Look, everyone's an expert in the property market, and there's views right across the board. But look,
you've got the actual experts. I mean, you've got Treasury modelling before your budget.
And look, we've also written down $8 billion over the last 12 months of what we actually expected going forward. But look, I think we're probably getting close to the bottom, and we should start seeing a rise. I mean, as I said, 14% reduction in the market since mid-2017. That's a significant drop. But look, if anything...
And that's across New South Wales, not just in Sydney?
Yeah, that's across New South Wales.
But you're going to have a further write-down greater than that $8 billion?
Look, I won't project that figure yet, but unlike other states, we've been monitoring this for 12 months, and going into the election, we were writing down stamp duty. I think that was an important position for us to take, because we wanted to make sure that the financial position, particularly when you're going into an election and both sides are going to be promising commitments, that we had a very accurate budget position, and that's what we've done. But look, what I'd say about the state finances in New South Wales is that they're rock solid, and we continue to power ahead where the leading economy and the finances are in great shape.
During the election campaign, Morrison didn't shy away from his faith, which is quite unusual for a political leader. You know, he allowed cameras into his church, he spoke about it. Bill Shorten then actually tried to use it against him, which, you know, was quite despicable, and Morrison called him out for that. But I think that the perception is that a lot of Australians, quiet Australians, as Morrison dubbed them, kind of warmed to him because he was not only his authentic self, but he, you know, showed this side of him. Yeah. You know, what's your approach to that? I mean, some of the areas that Morrison won over is where your electorate is as well. Yeah. You know, do you think voters are responding well when politicians show kind of this side of themselves?
Yeah, look, I mean, faith is one aspect of it, but I think that formed part of Scott Morrison really letting people into and providing insight into him and his family, who he was, what his values were, and faith was part of that. I think there was a range of issues in this election campaign, but one of them surely, I think, came around Scott's faith and the perceived mocking of him. I think Australians are a very tolerant people. People have faith. Some people don't have faith. But you don't have to have faith to respect people who do. And I think what Scott really demonstrated over that course of the campaign, obviously discipline in the way he campaigned, but he was there to unite. And I think that was very much in contrast to the Labor approach that pitted community against community, more of a class warfare, particularly when it came to the tax changes, and also a kind of an undercurrent of mocking people of faith when they made comments around. Around Scott's faith. They weren't just mocking him, they were probably mocking a whole lot of, as you say, white Australians right across the state.
Exactly. It was very divisive. And one issue that is still continuing to divide the community and Australians is what's happening with Israel Folau at the moment. Barnaby Joyce said yesterday that you can't bring people's faith and beliefs into a contract. This is a quote from Joyce. He said, your views on who God is, where God is, or whether there's a God should remain your own personal views and not part of any contractual obligation. Do you think he's right?
Look, it's a tough issue, and obviously, I'm a strong advocate of free speech, but I'm also a strong advocate that organisations should have the right to terminate employees if they see fit. But they should have grounds to do that. So the courts will see how that goes in the courts. I think some of the issues around the Israel Folau matter have been the hypocrisy of Rugby Australia in some ways preaching being inclusive as to why they've had to terminate Israel's contract. Yet at the same time, if you look at the position they took as an organisation during the marriage equality debate and plebiscite in this country, there are very strong views on either side of that debate. And the position that organisation took would have made many people within Rugby Australia, many of their players, particularly their Islanders, would have felt somehow excluded from that organisation. So
were they advocating for?
Yeah, they took a corporate position for a change in the law, and that's corporations can do what they will, but you can hardly preach to be inclusive when you're taking a position that would exclude many people within your organisation who hold a different view. And I think that hypocrisy has really been what many people have been offended by. And we'll see how that plays out in the courts.